Hello and welcome to another edition of the Kitchings Table. I'm your host, Earl Kitchings, and as always, we are so happy to be with you on this Tuesday morning here on Awesome Radio, WBISLP 106.9 FM. You can also catch us on YouTube, Facebook Live, Roku, and GPAC 23. We are always glad to be with you here on the Kitchings Table. And of course, joining me is my co host, Ronleen Kennedy. Good morning, Ronleen.
Good morning, Earl. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well and looking forward to having this conversation today because when I read an article recently and saw that the number of school districts in America that are still under desegregation orders from the federal government continues to be, in some cases, very shocking. I just wanted to bring this forth to everyone today because it's been 70 years almost since Brown versus the Board of Education, and we probably won't ever desegregate all school districts. It probably won't ever happen for various reasons that we will talk about in the show. But what are your thoughts about the fact that here we are 70, almost 70 years later, and we are still talking about desegregating school districts and desegregating schools?
It's very sad to me, and I'm so glad that you're bringing this forward. And in a previous show, we talked about one of the people that was on LinkedIn that came in on my feed, wanting to know. He said that he has never understood why we're talking about racism in this day and time. He doesn't understand. He just haven't seen any evidence of racism in this time, and it just made me wonder, where he's been. you know, and here we are today, talking about desegregation after 70 years later, and again makes me wonder, where has this individual been? And it made me think about when President Reagan was a candidate and he was in a debate. And when he talked about racism or whatever and said that, he had no knowledge that this kind of thing was going on. So I'm sure in his administration, desegregation had to be on that list some kind of way for him to resolve. So here we are, all of these years later, through all of the administrations that has come about, and we are still dealing with that article that you're talking about. 32 districts in the state of Mississippi that are not following orders.
Well, I'm glad you framed it that way, not following orders, because in some instances, it's not so much following orders, uh, it's just a failure to want to comply. And I think those are two distinct differences. Following orders could possibly mean you're making efforts, but just a failure, just failing, is like you're doing just enough to make it seem like you're doing something, but really you're not doing anything. You want that false pretense to be there so that the government will think you're doing something. And if the government is being honest with not only the people who it's affecting the most, but just being honest about the whole situation, they should basically take down those type of districts or the individuals who run those type of school districts. And it goes from being a state situation to being a local city situation or county situation with these schools and the districts that have yet to desegregate. And the fact that in 1956, March of 56, there were 101 Southern congressmen out of 128 who signed what they called the Southern Manifesto. denouncing the decision the Supreme Court made in the Brown versus the Board of Education to desegregate schools. And this, in its subtle way, has continued to be a part of the public educational fabric of America for almost 70 years. Now, we have to understand a couple of things. Although the 13th and 14th Amendments, which came about after slavery, which give people opportunities to have their voices heard and to impact representation, has been on the books. The fact of the matter is this for our school systems throughout the country that deal with public schools. It goes to the fact of neighborhoods being segregated. Many of the schools in your community or the neighborhood you live in reflect just the way that neighborhood looks from the people who live in those neighborhoods. And I don't necessarily know if that dynamic will ever change. It can maybe have some places where it has some interactions where white and black students and other students of color attend the same school. But when we get to the crux of the matter, when you have real suburban schools, and I think that's a code word, suburban schools, we kind of understand suburban and urban. But when we have the suburban schools that reflect the people who live in those suburban areas, primarily the majority of them, they're going to look Caucasian or white. When we look at the communities in the urban area, for the most part, they're going to look predominantly African American or black. You get some crossover when you have certain schools in certain areas, depending on where they are. But until that changes, and part of that segregation from housing is partly the fault of the federal government because they found ways to manipulate their own system to minimize blacks and other people of color from living or moving where they wanted to, or those communities found ways to make it very uncomfortable for you to want to be in those communities. So as we look at our neighborhoods and our communities of where we live, and it's just like the saying they make the about Sunday. What is the most segregated day in America? It is Sunday. Ironically, it's not supposed to be that, but people go to the church they feel comfortable with. They don't want to be diverse to some degree. And I think we all understand those dynamics. People, even at work, even in social settings, people gravitate to people they feel comfortable with or people they know. That's just human factors. That's not going to ever change in this day and time in 2023. However, as unless diversity gets to be stronger and more steeped in the way people deal with each other, we're going to always have, or there will always be this very fine, I won't say a fine line, but there will always be this line that separates. And it's, where we live, where we worship, and how we interact over those two things. And if you live in a community that's in suburbia and your church is in that suburban neighborhood, you can pretty much expect that everybody who goes to that church and lives in those neighborhoods, they all look the same. I mean, that's just human nature. And a lot of times, as they say, we are fearful of the things we don't know, or we will take what someone says that's negative and make it truth when those truths are far from the truth, but they continue to find itself in the fabrics of our country. So we have segregated school districts, but it's because you said there were 32 in Mississippi. Would you want to take a guess as to why there are 32 school districts in Mississippi that are desegregated or still facing desegregation penalties or court um, involvement? Would you just care to speculate why that is the case in Mississippi?
Well, we know Mississippi has a history for prominent racism.
Mm.
And as I'm looking, I'm thinking about the Jim Crow laws, that shaped all of this to begin with. And when they are not made to do something, they're going to go back, to what, as you said, human nature, their human nature. So I'm thinking this is why this is done. This practice is still going on because they just weren't made to. There's so many things going on in the United States right now until that's like, that's the bottom of the chain, as in, the education sector. But until something happens to wherein they get sanctioned, some kind of repercussion comes behind that, that's the only way things are going to change, it seems like to me, for it to be going on, extending 70 years later.
Well, a federal judge in Mississippi did put out the order to desegregate school districts in Mississippi. That is documented. However, we get back to what I just said about communities, where they are, how they're structured, what's going on in those communities. So, to give you an example of one particular district in Mississippi, Cleveland, Mississippi specifically, a town of 12,000 people, and oftentimes the physical dividing line between north and south or east and west. And it's funny. Now, when you lived in Chicago, what side of Chicago did you live in? The east side or the west side, north side or south side?
South side.
South side. Now, you can go south side and you can go to another town and live on the east side. And you know what you're gonna find in either the south side or the east side?
Was that
Black people.
okay?
I've yet to hear of, well, I won't say yet to hear, but normally when you hear about major cities like that, they say, well, I'm from the south side, I'm from the east side. Normally that's where you find, where black people stay. I know here in Jacksonville, we have a north side where the black people live, which is kind of uncommon. But that's just the only dividing point. We don't have a east side that's black. Well, once upon a time we did, but I never thought that was east side because it's still on the north side. The river divides the city, so
Okay.
when you cross the river, you're in the eastern part of Jacksonville. But when we talk about these communities, and in reading some of the information, it talked about how a railroad track, which is a physical dividing marker, runs through a town, and it says here in Cleveland, people live on the east side. Those are the black people. People who live on the west side, those are the white people. So that distinction automatically sets things up. So in this article from NPR, and I quote, it says, in a school district where approximately 67% of the students are black. Now, this is a town that's just got 12,000 people, but 67% of the students are black and 30% of the students are white. Half of Cleveland schools, half of Cleveland schools are on the east side of the railroad tracks. Half. Half. And all they're black or virtually all black, and the other schools were disproportionately white. Now we're talking about a railroad track dividing. I mean, a railroad track doesn't divide a very large swath of land. I mean, when you run that railroad track through a piece of land, it's, those railroad tracks are only, 4 or 5, no more than 10 yards wide when you go from side to side. So it's not like it's a big dividing piece. But once you cross, and you cross from one side, and I remember growing up when you cross from the city to the county line, the city had street lights and the county didn't. I know some people might find that kind of hard to believe, but that's the way it was. You left city run government and there were street lights. When you got to the county wasn't as proactive and it didn't always have street lights everywhere. And I know this because I lived on that side of the track because there was a railroad track that divided city and county here. And once you cross that track, it was funny. It was almost like it was a street light right near where the railroad tracks were. And it was, you stop at the stop sign before you turn to cross the railroad track, and it's lit up. But as soon as you cross that railroad track, it got pitch black because there were no street lights anywhere. So when we talk about, what's really going on, it's communities being divided because of where people live. And because that's where we live, and like they said, the schools are in those communities, well, the people who live in the suburbs aren't really interested in sending their children to schools in urban America. However, there is a dy- dynamic change to that mindset if you have a high quality school in an urban area, a high quality school, quote unquote college prep school in an urban area, and the benefit from attending that high quality college prep school is going to net you opportunities for better college scholarships, and you're almost in a bubble when you go to that school in that community because you're kind of isolated. Then parents from the suburbs have no problem with their children attending that particular school. Now, the children who live in that particular area hardly can get in a school like that. So here again another dynamic of what's going on with this. But when we talk about Mississippi having 32 school districts still under desegregation orders, NPR also said that when the school districts were accused of resistance or ill will to this desegregation, it's not because they didn't make an effort, they just failed to do anything. And that's why those 32 districts, and if they're like the city of Cleveland, Mississippi, they're going to remain under desegregation orders because, they took away the busing as part of desegregation. That had to be eliminated because it was forcing kids to ride all over town just to get to a school to give some balance. So you can't make some people send their children to schools where they don't want them to attend. So as Mississippi deals with this federal order for 32 school districts to clean up their act, change things, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, I don't foresee Mississippi, unless the state of Mississippi totally flip flops and becomes, this state where they're so diverse and they can, walk across lines and have brotherly love or whatever you want to say they need. I don't see it ever changing simply because those communities, based on their structure, based on who lives where, they're not going to change. And one of the things I've always thought and felt creates these separations is economics. And as long as economics stay on the west side, as long as they stay on the west side, there's not going to ever be much parity, equality, and diversity because when people make two times or three times as much money as a family that's making that much less, it's not going to get better. If your family is making six figures and my family is not even hitting $40,000, it can't get better. You have more economic power than I have to live and move and do what you need to do. So the economics of things, jobs and salaries dictate who gets what and who lives where. And you live where you can afford. And if you can't afford to live in those communities that require, low 200,000s and up, then you're going to live where you're supposed to or can. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why we won't see much of a change in these school districts, seeing much change in the desegregation, or simply because going back to the town of Cleveland, 12,000 people, blacks live on the east side, whites live on the west side. I guarantee you, if you went there and looked at the economics, go there and look at the economics of, what's going on, who has the government jobs making the high salaries, the county jobs making the high salaries, and whatever other industry there making the salaries, you're going to see a, a very different picture based on the numbers. But that's my take on why we're at this point, and it's going to remain. It's going to continue for, I don't know, for a little while longer, maybe less, maybe more. I don't know.
Hmm. So interesting that you say that because today's dedication is for the children of our future. And if our let's use the 12,000 of those people whose children are being educated on the east versus the west. As you say, this going to continue because the west, they're going to have the higher paying jobs. The east, they're going to be in the lower paying jobs. And it's stated that um, children in the suburban areas, they know what it's like to work some kind of form of work of being able to earn an income by the time they're 14, 15, 16 years old. Whereas looking at this 12,000 in population, that number is significantly less. As a matter of fact, it goes on to say by the time a child is 14, 15, 16 years old, they still have not scored their first job yet. So we know economics, as you say, always say, follow the money. We know economics control everything. That goes back to the redlining in the neighborhoods. You're trying to get upgrades done. You're trying to get your roof replaced. Those people that are living on the west side have no problem of scoring a loan in their banking system. You know, and the people that are on the east side, they can bank at those same banks, and they're being declined,
Mm-hmm.
declined, declined. But yet, it doesn't matter how much money they have sitting in the bank in their savings or what have you,
Yep.
they're going to be declined. And therefore, property value goes down because the roof can't be fixed, the siding can't be fixed, anything that's hindering the house from being, brought up to code, as codes are changing, those resources has to come out of something. And so, as you say, if a family is making $40,000, $50,000 less than the family across the tracks, then that $40,000, $50,000, we know that meets just the essentials, as far as putting bread on the table and feeding a family, much less trying to get a child through school. Just high school alone is expensive. So to try to get a child through college on $40,000 or less to feed a whole family, as the single people saying $40,000 won't sustain them, because by the time they purchase a home and a car and the insurances that go along with it, they're out of money and they're struggling each day. And gas still has to go into their vehicle in order to get them to their jobs.
Well, these things are true, and the economics will always factor into the final outcomes for many situations. So, as I continue to do research and look through articles, I ran across this article from NPR Radio, National Public Radio Morning Edition by Sequoia Carrillo and Pooja Salhotra. And they cited a few things and wrote it in their article. Number one, the United States Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, released a report that stated a third of students attend a predominantly same race ethnicity school during the 2021 school year. And that translates into I go to the school that's in my neighborhood. And they also cited 70% of students that attend their neighborhood public schools. Now, public, we're only talking about public schools. We're not talking about private schools. And the public school part of this is because your tax dollars go to public educational funding. Those tax dollars fund Title III schools, public schools. So we're not talking about the private dollars. But uh, it states that racially segregated neighborhoods have historically made for racially segregated schools. That's it in a nutshell. Again, I want to live in a community where I feel comfortable or safe. People look like me and I can relate to. And sometimes those neighborhoods can be challenging, but that's the reality of it. Like I stated earlier, you live where you want to live. And most of the time, the people who live in those communities look like you. But when we start to broaden our opportunities or our thinking, when we start to broaden our thinking about living in communities, when you live in a diverse community, you're not living there for you to be best friends with your neighbors or to have them over for dinner every other week or anything like that. You're basically wanting to just be able to live your life in terms of being respectful and decent to one another. I don't have to like you, I will respect you. I don't have to love you, but I'll treat you decently. And those two things are at the crux of when you move in a very diverse community. We don't have to be buddy buddy, but I'll respect you and your property and your children, and I will expect you to do the same for me. And as long as we can maintain that civility, things should be okay. But when we cross those lines, when we can't be respectful or treat each other with decency or humanity, that's when the problems start. So when we talk about how things can change, this article talks about, why the neighborhoods look the way they do. Well, again, people choose the way they want to live. Um, and they cited this one lack of significant improvement in this, according to the GOA, is a practice known as district secession. When we talk about schools, why the schools don't look different, district secession. And this is where schools break away from an existing district, often citing a need for more local control. We need more local control, so we don't want to be in that district. We're going to set up our own district out here in suburbia and create our own school district, and then we'll have more control. And the result finds that deepens segregation. It seems like you keep trying to run away from the issue as opposed to accepting and embracing the issue. And I do understand that you want to live in a community that feels good for you. We all do. I know there are times when I'm writing and I'm looking at what's going on in certain communities and what's going on. I'm like, I wish for every child to be able to ride their bicycle on a sidewalk down the street and throughout their community without running into any problems. Recently, I was going to play golf on Sunday, and I saw a white kid, and this has got nothing to do with trying to identify racial things. This is just what I saw. He was on a motorized scooter, and you know where he was going, Ronleen? He was on the sidewalk on his motorized scooter, and you know where he was going?
Where?
He was going to McDonald's.
Okay.
He's on his motorized scooter, and a motorized scooter can only take one passenger, so
Right.
there's nobody else riding. And he went to McDonald's and got his purchase, and he headed back home. I want that for all communities. I want every community whose children live in these communities to have the security and the safety to be able to ride a motorized scooter to McDonald's and get my order and go back home without having any issue. I wish that for all neighborhoods, all communities. But life is not like that, especially in challenged neighborhoods.
Hmm. Earl, hold that thought. Let's do station identification.
You're here with us today on the Kitchings Table on Awesome Radio, WBISLP 106.9 FM. Check us out on YouTube, Facebook Live, Roku, and GPAC 23. We are always glad to have you, and please check us out every Tuesday at 10 o'clock here on Awesome Radio, WBISLP. All right. So, going back to this desegregation thing, I went across researching, and of course, you got to provide numbers if you're going to do research to talk about some things that are important like this. And this is what I found according to the numbers. The, let's say that I found on a ProPublica website. Every state in the union, other than West Virginia, Montana, and Wyoming, are under federal desegregation orders. Do I need to repeat that? Every state in the union. How many states do we have? 50. So you take these three away, that means we have 47 states. Every state in the union, other than West Virginia, Montana, and Wyoming, are under federal desegregation orders. And it doesn't matter whether it's 100 or one. If you're one desegregation order, you're under desegregation orders from the federal government. But West Virginia, Montana, and Wyoming have zero. Now, it's easy to understand why Wyoming and Montana are going to be zero. That's very easy to understand. Not too many people of color moving to Montana and Wyoming. That is country that is wide open lands and it's cold. And I don't know about you. I'm not in favor of being in any place where it's cold and I got to deal with snow 30 to 40% of the time of the year. And then in West Virginia, it's cold and it's snowy, even though it's on the western sector of America. But they don't have any desegregation orders in place. So Montana and Wyoming, because they don't have many black people living out there, they don't have to worry about it. West Virginia, sort of the same thing. But when I put the numbers together and went down a list and I graded them, 1 to 5 as the top 5 states with the most school districts under desegregation orders. And as you can imagine, most of the states are going to be in what part of the country, Ron Lee?
So
The South. Gee, you told me you lived on South Chicago?
I did.
Think about that. Problems with school districts in the South. You lived in South Chicago. That's where black people live. Just think about the parity in all of this now. So anyway, uh, the number one state with the number of school districts uh, that are under desegregation, according to this survey, Mississippi was number one. Even though we said it was 32, they're identifying 62. Number two was Alabama with 54. Number three was Georgia with 48. Number four was Texas with 29. And number five was North Carolina with 22. Those are the number of school districts that are under federal desegregation orders. South Carolina and Tennessee right at 16 and 17. Kentucky with 7. Arkansas with 16. Florida with 19. Now, here are the states outside of the South, outside of the South Side. Louisiana, 38. California, 31. Missouri, 19. Arizona, 18. Maryland, 5. And West Virginia at 0. So when we talk about maybe about 15 states that, are having this issue, and anything above 10, so that's right around 15 states that have, you know, 10 or more school districts that are under federal orders. It says a lot about the communities where these schools are located. A lot. And uh, ProPublica did a great job on identifying information and issues about what's going on. And it helped me to zero in on one particular city, not to pick on them, but just to cite the information about what's going on. And the city is St. Louis, Missouri. Now, you said you lived in South Side Chicago, Ronnie?
I did.
I see. And that other side of town where you will find predominantly black people will be like East Side. If you lived on the east side of the city, you lived in a predominantly black area. So, have you ever heard of East St. Louis?
I've heard of East St. Louis,
Do
yes.
you know what state East St. Louis is in?
Missouri?
Nope.
Detroit?
Detroit is not a state. Stop.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Stop it.
All right, what
What
is it?
what state is East St. Louis in?
I want to say Missouri, but you're saying not.
It is not.
Okay.
Now, here's the unique thing about it. St. Louis, Missouri has a metro population of 2.8 million people. 2.8. Known as a global city. It's has a gross product of more than $160 billion that goes through the city. But East St. Louis, now, if we're not divided by a railroad track to divide our communities, what might be the other physical divider in a city to put you from either on one side or the other? What
Water?
might be,
A
huh?
bridge?
A
Or water?
bridge, a water, which would be a river
River? Okay.
or a lake, but primarily a river. So on the opposite side of, I want to say the Missouri River or the Mississippi River, I'm sorry, Mississippi River. On the east side of the Mississippi River that divides Missouri from Illinois is East St. Louis. East St. Louis. St. Clair, Illinois is where East St. Louis is located. And they have a population of about 19,000 people.
Mm.
Okay. So when we talk about what divides us and how communities are separated. Here we are thinking, if you hear East St. Louis, you think, well, that must be on the east side of St. Louis, Missouri. Yes, on the east side of St. Louis, Missouri, in Illinois.
In Illinois, okay.
In Illinois. But the school district in St. Louis, they have about in the center, the hub, the inner city or whatever, they have about 23,000 students, 79% being black and 13% being white. But then when you kind of spread that out, it gets a little larger. That area, that school district, which is the St. Louis County School District, they have 175 public schools serving 38,000 students, and the average tuition cost of a private school in Missouri is $10,442. 64% of private schools in St. Louis County, Missouri are religiously affiliated, either Christian or Catholic. I think that's what we'll find most times when we talk about religious affiliated schools. And 36 public charter schools serving 11,823 students are in St. Louis. Now, the population of St. Louis, Missouri, not East St. Louis, the population of St. Louis, Missouri is 45.6 black, 46.4 white.
Mm.
That's the line. Too close to call. Almost a dead heat, even on each side. However, going back to the numbers I cited, Missouri has 19 districts, school districts under desegregation orders. 19, Missouri. And as great of a city probably as St. Louis is, the medium income in St. Louis is right at 48.7 thousand. But when I looked at and broke the numbers out, it's 55,000 on an average that a white person gets in salary versus 28,000 for a black person. So that's about 100% more. How do we how do we balance things out when the economics have this disparity? How do we get there? How can you expect school districts to be balanced, or even if they are segregated, to get the same things when the economics aren't going to match? It's just not possible.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about desegregating schools, heaven forbid they ever go back to talking about busing, because that was an experiment that failed miserably. It had its pluses, but it was not good for children of color. Would you want your 7, 8 year old child getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to catch a bus to go across town 20 miles or 30 minutes to get to a school? And if something happened to them, you got to, rush, get through traffic or whatever. You got to travel to get to that school versus being right there in the community where you're living. But this is what we're faced with. And this is why I thought there was a need to make people aware that the desegregation issue in America public schools is still alive and well, and there may not be a solution to it simply because there's no solution to where we live and worship. We don't diversify from that standpoint. So we go to school where I live, I go to church where I live, and that's just basic human practice. Ronleen?
Agreed. That's spot on when you're talking about it from that point. Also, I'm looking at it from the economics of that. If you only have $28,000 coming into your home, and into your household, and you really do not have $28,000 coming into your home because of taxes, and taxes that are being paid to your school districts.
Right.
So
Right.
it's being paid to your school districts, but yet your child is not getting or receiving the proper education in order for them to be able to, just out of high school, be able to get a job to get past that $28,000, you
Right.
know. And in my experience coming out of school, not immediately being able to go to college, then I can understand why so many people get behind. They never catch up because they were failed from the beginning. And it goes back to what we were talking about in previous shows. Every generation seems like they have to start from the very basic, because there isn't, if you look at it from the point where you were talking about today, you can't leave wealth behind in order for the next generation to be able to build upon that. So the solution would be you have to find a way in order for that to happen. So whether that be a second job that is in place specifically for building wealth for your generations, you um, paying that investment, you're paying into that insurance premium, whatever vehicle that you decide, it has to start somewhere in order to get your generation from point A to point B, and teach that to your generation so that that can be the common practice. It can't be business as usual the way we've experienced it over the last 60, 70, 80 years, and prior to. So that's one solution. The next solution I'm looking at is going back to where you worship. Schools can be started there. I understood from the articles that I read that you may have to consider teaching your children privately so that they can be in position to get the scholarships and do very well in school and not be under this academic consequence when they can't, or them feeling like college isn't for them or higher education isn't for them. We have to find a way to end that and to close that gap on that. Mm, I can't hear you.
As our ancestors have shared with us years and years ago, education is the key to moving forward. Now, for those who don't see that or don't value that, that's fine. But without that particular tool, without having some education or without being educated to the max, without learning as much as you can, you're going to seem to always be trying to catch up in many different ways. And as we spoke about last week with Cheryl, building wealth takes time. And you got to create and have a pool of money in order to create larger pools of money to create wealth. And that all takes time. Whereas if you've already got access to funds and you have people who can give you more access to funds, you increase your opportunity to grow your wealth exponentially and at a different pace. But as we deal with schools and where we are with desegregating our schools and being that now, once upon a time, private schools did not have that big effect on public schools, but they've changed the game now. So now you've got not only just private schools, but you have charter public schools who are taking the funding from those needed schools in those places where they continue to be behind. And again, as the goalposts often move, to make sure that those with less can't keep up. The game changes and we stay behind. So until there's more harsher penalties made or until some other things change, we're going to be dealing with this for a while. And I don't know if there's a solution. I think we just have temporary fixes and try to fix things as we go. But for the most part, I think we're going to be dealing with desegregated or segregated school systems under desegregation orders for a while now. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. So you have been listening and watching the Kitchings Table here on Awesome Radio, WBISLP 106.9 FM. Catch us also on Roku, GPAC 23, Facebook Live, and of course on YouTube. We hope that next Tuesday you will again join us for another day of information and observation, research, and data. That's what I like to think we continue to do, Ron Lean. We dive into or delve into these things. But until next Tuesday here on the Kitchings Table, we're going to say take care, have a great rest of your week, and do something positive for somebody else. For Ron Lee Kennedy, I'm Earl Kitchings, and we both say so long till next time.
Thank you.